Welcome to the Martin Sieff and Pelle Neroth Taylor Show, Capitals Uncovered. Today we've got Garland Nixon with us, one of the top progressive podcasters and news hosts in the United States. He's been on all kinds of programs in the mainstream, but also in the alternative media, and is a household name for many. So we're very privileged to have you on, Garland. Thanks for joining us. I know that you've been. We talked a little bit about Russia with John Helmer earlier. We might turn to that. But I was going to talk a little bit about Finland, because I'm just writing two articles, one about the Finnish Winter War, which was 1939, 1940, and then I'm doing something on Finlandization, which is the period in the 1960s and 70s and 80s when Finland played a very careful diplomatic game that allowed it to have a very advanced democracy and a capitalist society, if that's what you go for, but very prosperous and free and everything. At the same time as they were friendly with the Soviet Union, which allowed them actually to export stuff to the Soviets. And if you went to the Soviet Union in the 1980s, you saw the things that work tend to be Finnish,
Yes.
Finnish elevators, Finnish supermarket goods. They all had this strange Finnish script on them. And people went to Finland to get a breathing hole. And the the thing is, the reason and I put it out on my Substack, and it's had a lot of feedback, positive feedback. People from all kinds of backgrounds, all back, say, "Oh, well, we didn't know that. That's really interesting." If you're in Scandinavia, as we are, Finlandization is a very well-known concept, and it's extraordinary to those of us who lived through that prosperous, peaceful period in Scandinavia when the Cold War was raging outside. Norway was admittedly part of NATO, and Finland was pro-Soviet, but it was very peaceful, it could have been a region where people armed to the teeth, but there was practically demilitarized. So the immediate south of that, which everyone knows, is the East-West Berlin and East-West German confrontation, 500,000 men facing each other. Well, Scandinavia had almost nothing, and it was a sort of tacit agreement. The Norwegians kept off the NATO. They had no NATO. They trained some special forces from the Brits, but they didn't allow NATO. They certainly didn't allow NATO troops. And the Finns, they could, I think, Kekon and talk to the KGB resident chief about once a week. They had this famous sauna diplomacy. He went hiking and mountaineering and hunting with Kosygin, I think was his best friend inside the Politburo, for a week, a year. And he really got to understand what the Soviets were worried about and how they were thinking. And it wasn't that they wanted to occupy Finland or whatever. What the story that we've heard is the Polish story and the Baltic story of the oppressive Stalinist juggernaut. This is their take, that just wants to kill the Poles and oppress them. And we had that a lot here in Europe on Europe Day. It's the 9th of May, of course, and not a single mention of Russia, which of course liberated Germany, and it was all the Europe, it's propaganda. And the more I commented on these Europe Day adverts on my Facebook, the more I got, because they don't even say, take me off your stupid mailing list. And I get more and more of them because they think any interest is positive interest. So every stupid little 2-bit institution in the European Union, the sort of Latvian embassy to Brussels and or whatever, gave me their message about Europe Day. Russia wasn't mentioned once. Europe Day, it was 9th of May, is a Russian day. It's when that's exactly because they delayed that signing of the victory to the 9th of May. In Europe, I think it was the 5th of May. Western Europe, it was the 5th of May when peace was signed. Anyway, so when the German Chancellor was asked, who liberated you? He wouldn't give an answer because, of course, it was the Russians that liberated Berlin. Anyway, but we've got this very strong picture, and the East Europeans are selling this very much, that Victory Day was a victory over Nazis are not mentioned, but the idea is that the Soviets were the bad guys. Kaya Kallas, the foreign minister of Europe, either she pretends not to know or she doesn't know that the Russians were fighting on the Allied side. They were the Allies, 28 million of them, 4 holocausts, as if it were, died to liberate Europe, and it might also have occupied Europe. Anyway, but we get this very much idea of the double occupation, that the poor East Europeans were occupied by Hitler and then they were occupied by the Soviet Union. Fine. Okay. Well, I'm not going to go into that argument, but there is another story, and there's always another story, and which is that the Finns fought on the Nazi side. They helped besiege Leningrad. They fought the Winter War, which actually could have been resolved peacefully, because Stalin actually offered them territory twice as much as what they were going to be taken from the Finns. Leningrad was just 30 kilometers from the Finnish border. The Russians wanted a little bit more, and so Stalin went in to seize that because it was a security issue. I mean, not a nice thing, but not as black and white, you might say, as you might think. The Finns were very pro-German. They went in and joined Hitler, as the Swedes wanted to do, but the Swedes were more cautious. Besieged Leningrad, and millions of Russians died. And then you think, well, the Russians are going to annex us now. No, they didn't. They occupied a Finnish base off the coast of Helsinki for 10 years until 1955. They permanently took a thin stretch of Arctic landscape in the north, and then they pulled out. And they had this peaceful agreement which allowed for consultations. But basically, the Finnish promise was, we are not going to be a security threat to you. Now, I've just been reading the memoirs of a guy called Max Jakobsson, who's a Swedish-Finnish diplomat, probably the most famous Finnish statesman in the. He basically was the architect of this peaceful coexistence with Russia. And he said they didn't want to dominate us, they didn't want to control us, they didn't want to Stalinize us. They just were worried about security. They didn't want us to be used as an invasion route. And as long as you could, and he said, I spent years with Soviet diplomats all the time. They were not interested. They liked us. They liked our system. They could see that it was a breathing hole. And they were just worried about their security. And if you could relax that, if you could make them comfortable about that, they weren't interested in your domestic politics. And that, to me, seems like an obvious route forward for Ukraine if peace ever comes to Ukraine. I'm amazed that the Finnish leaders who've been joined NATO in 2024 and made NATO, Finland, a target for the Russians. They should know better. They know that. They've got that in their bones. They've read it in their history books. Some of them are even old enough to remember Finlandization the first time round. So it seems to me that the reason why I got a lot of positive commentary on this article, which looked at the Winter War, but it also looks a little bit forward into the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, where Helsinki was as rich and packed with consumer goods as Stockholm or Copenhagen. Why the Finns don't talk about that as a possible model for Ukraine, and if it is a good possible model for Ukraine, and should we be discussing it more? And as a sort of Scandinavian, I think it's something you could put on the table, because the younger generation of Scandinavians, sadly, they're harkening back to a much older model of Scandinavian occupation of Russia, basically. I mean, Swedes founded the fortress, which later became St. Petersburg, and they've had strong imperial interest in both the Baltic states and in Russia. And I think there's a lot of businessmen, a lot of the Wallenberg industrial concern, they want Russia because they think, well, we can run the Arctic Russia much better than anyone they can, because we have our own Arctic zone, which we run very successfully. Garland, what do you think of this idea that Finland should be a kind of role model for Ukraine after peace breaks out?
Well, a couple of things I'll say, and I'll harken back to this. I knew nothing about Belarus. I was able to go to Belarus and travel around and talk to people there, right? And what I found was this, and I'll just put it like this: a firm grasp of the obvious, a clear understanding of the power dynamics. People would say
Yes.
things like, look, we're a small country of whatever it is, 9 million, right? We're unable to stand up against major a military economic attack from a major power. Therefore, we have to mitigate that. Here's the reality: we are on Russia's border. And they said, look, our culture is different from Russia, our food, they call us the Belo-Russians, meaning white Russian. But we're different. We're fine with the Russians there. But here's the deal: we're on the border of a major superpower. And there are other countries that have animosity toward this superpower. We have to make decisions that secures our security as a small nation that's unable to stand up against major world powers, right? That if you think about it, going back at a time of Finland, a country, what do they got, 6, 7 people, right? There's a reality. You're not that large of a military or economic power, and you're on the border of a major military economic power. Mexico, Canada, whoever you are, you have to look at the dynamics surrounding you and make decisions based on your best interests. Even if you say, well, we'll side with these countries who are coming after Russia. Well, if you're Estonia, if you're Finland, if a war starts, you're going to get flattened day one. You're just a cannon fire. You're in the way. Even if ultimately one side or the other wins, you're in a situation where you're caught between, if you ever get caught between great power conflict dynamics, it's not the reality, the kinetic reality. It's not going to work out well for you. So you have to say to me, like Belarus said, we're on the border of a large world power, and we have to make decisions based in our best interest based on that. And furthermore, if you're on the border, Canada, Mexico, of a huge power with lots of people that does world trade, right? How can I benefit from that? I can sell them, widgets. I can sell them fruit, vegetables, whatever I have, I can sell them herring and they'll buy herring. So I have a large market next to me. How can I take advantage of a large market next to me that's in my best interest? I have a large military target next to me for other world powers. How can I mitigate that so that I don't suffer as a result of it? And it becomes down to this: how do I, as a Finland, look out for my best interest? Diplomatically, economically, militarily. That's all. It's not whether you like or hate the Russians or anything like that. If I'm on the border of the US, I got to think about that. If I'm on the border of China, I have to think about these things. And what we're seeing now is countries who are choosing ideological alliances. If you are Finland, if you're Kaja Kallas, well, of course, because let's not forget there were a lot of people in that region who, when the Nazis came, they were siding with the Nazis more fervent about killing Jews than the Nazis were. I mean, there were some very Eastern Europe, some very, very ideologically extreme people who were quite violent. So the unfortunately,
Exactly.
the people who seem to be in power now and making a lot of decisions, they hearken their political legacy back to those very, very bad people. So I think that's what we're looking at to simplify it for Finland and for any. Their dynamic is not different than any country on the border of a world power.
Mm.
WWIN. What is it? WW. What is it? WI. Bottom line is, what's in it for me?
Mm.
I heard someone say one time, what everybody listens
Yes.
to the same radio station. Was it WIIFM or whatever? WIIFM. What's in it for me? And it becomes, hey, okay, how can we look out for ourselves? Well, if somebody at the U.S. calls, you need to do this against Russia. Yeah, but you're on the other side of the world, and we're right here. And I think that's what we're with Finlandization, with all of these things. It was maybe a time when Finland looked at the true dynamics in the region and said, what's in it for us? And how can we take advantage of that situation? And again, right now, my gosh, you got a big market next to you. Finland was making a lot of money off of Russia and all the people crossing the border and still should be.
Yeah. As said, I mean, the Russians had the Finns, even they were occupied by Russia in 1809, and it was a Swedish colony or part of Sweden before that. And the Swedes have never quite forgotten the Russians for that because it was their Lebensraum, if you like, and a lot of Swedish aristocrats, quite close to the Germans, quite close to the Nazis, quite Nazi in their thinking or Prussian. Um,
Exactly.
they felt the Finns were their people, never mind that they spoke Swedish. They finished, but they had to speak Swedish when they're speaking to their masters, the master race, the
Exactly.
Swedes. And the Finns were lesser beings, and the Russians actually encouraged Finnish nationalism. Partly it was instrumental because they wanted to set them against the Swedes, who were still exerted a lot of soft power on the Finns. But even so, as I sometimes say to Finns, if it wasn't for the Russians, you'd be speaking Swedish because that's what happened to the Lapps, the Sami, who were brutalized and treated very badly, and their lands were used for the Swedish mining companies. So, I mean, the Swedes have this holier than thou attitude towards the rest of the world, and they rely on the fact that no one knows anything about Sweden except this aura of sanctimonious, virtue, which traitors like myself expose. No, I mean, anyway. So when the Russians, Swedes accuse the Russians of being imperialists. It's a bit like a pot calling kettle black because the Swedes have been imperialist in their small part of the world, and the Finns they were fighting over the Finland. So there's a resentment that cannot be quenched there, and there is a class of Finns. Nationalist class, the Finnish speakers who want Karelia, which is Ugric, Finno-Ugric speaking, and it goes all the way up northern Russia, and they feel, well, that's ours. And also the sort of Swedish elite, the business elite in Sweden are still very anti-Russian, the ones in Finland. And what you needed, you had these statesmen like Jakobson Kekkonen who said, we're not slaves by listening to the power. We're actually autonomous. We're exercising autonomous, like in the same way that if you're navigating the rapids or facing a dragon and you're very careful around that dragon, doesn't mean you're a slave to that dragon. It means you're very careful and you're exercising your maximum skill and autonomy to survive in that very tough environment. And so Max Jockerson's book was an eye opener. I mean, no one's heard of him in the Anglosphere. But his argument, his book is one of the best realist defenses I've ever read. Defense for the kind of policy that Martin, I think you, Garland, espouse. And but because of course he had to hone his argument every day when he was in the diplomatic halls. He had to talk to Americans saying, "Oh, you Finns, you're just slaves to the Soviets." So he had a if you want to read a realist argument, I'd highly advise you to do that. And Finlandization was actually a word that the neocons invented to do down the Finns. They said we and then the other thing, and I'll bring Martin in here because I think you were around at the time. The Finns can actually say, well, we're the ones who invented the Helsinki agreements of
Oh,
1975.
yes. Yes.
So we actually toppled the Soviet Empire because the Soviets went along with that. And then it was used by the dissidents to say it was basically a human rights package that the Soviets had to agree to. And that, in a way, contributed a lot to toppling the USSR. So the Finns did topple the USSR after all, in the way that guns and missiles didn't from the USA. Martin, yeah, you're agreeing
No,
there.
no, I listen with uh, uh, gratitude and fascination to your analysis, Pele, and to yours, Garland, because I realized my first reaction was to have put an Irish perspective on this. Because, Garland, your analysis of how small powers in general have to act fits is a brilliant assessment of Finland's triumph for so long, which the current leadership has thrown out of the window catastrophically. It is also a proof of the brilliant success of Irish diplomacy in dealing with Britain over the past 100 years. When Ireland became independent, nobody expected the independence to last. The British regretted having given it up. They kicked out David Lloyd George as Prime Minister for granting Irish independence in the first place. There were assassinations and destabilizations in Ireland carried out by the British, unacknowledged to this day, in the early years of independence. All of the above, which I clearly you are very familiar with too. And as you know, it's a virtually unknown story in the mainstream. But Ireland succeeded, and they succeeded precisely by the kind of cool, balanced realism, purging themselves of hatred in dealing with Britain. You have a giant next door, you're sleeping next to a whale or a dinosaur. The dinosaur or the whale may not want to eat you, but it's enormous. So you just have to watch your step. Anyway, you have to carefully calibrate your steps. Now, this is what the Finns have done. And this is where your brilliant assessment comes in. But I realized the Israelis, for example, have thrown this assessment out of the window. If you look at the first 30 years of Israeli history, especially under David Ben Gurion and Moshe Dayan, when they were in charge of Israeli strategy, they were ruthless. They fought serious wars. But they were also recognized Israel was tiny and would remain tiny, and had to avoid getting sucked into larger whirlpools of confrontation and destruction. Now, the current leadership in Israel and the population in general, I think, are drunk on the fantasies of Weltpolitik, of world power, and mad dreams of greater Israel and this, that, and the other, and standing up to Iran. Iran has 93 million people. Israel has 7 million Jewish citizens in it, as well as 3 or 4 million Palestinian Arabs people in it as well, who are not do not, I think, largely regard themselves as citizens. But for Ireland, with 4 or 5 million people, to attempt to confront, let alone attempt to dream of destroying or conquering a Britain of 70 to 75 million people, thankfully nobody dreams of it. It would be madness. It would be madness. So I think your analysis, Garland, on Finland, and it also applies to those in Taiwan who imagine that they can face down China or thumb the nose at China, this vast nation of 1.3 billion people beside you, which you are basically part of anyway. But you have to accommodate yourself to reality. And that's what the Finns did. And it seems to me it's what the Finns are now forgetting that they have did. But again, Garland, I think your assessment is a key to avoiding world war in a vast number of areas. As you say, these are generalized dynamics. Finland and Austria, too, at the same time, gave us admirable examples of this. But again, we're in a world where all the real lessons and wisdoms of the past 70 and 80 years are being thrown overboard. Why are they being thrown overboard? I mean, and
Yeah.
how can we get sanity back, guys? What would
Well,
you both
Garland,
recommend?
yeah. What do you think? Why are we in this crazy situation? The Scandinavians are all warmongering, having been at peace and worked for them for 250 years, and other parts of the world which you know better.
Well, I think we're seeing something, and this is on a broad basis in a
Yes,
lot of areas, right? And that's this. I remember a guy I went to school with. I'll just say his name was Jim. And when we were in elementary school, he was kind of a puny kid and he got pushed around by some of the bullies. When we were in 10th grade, the kid was 6'5", 250 pounds of solid muscle. In 10th grade, he was 16 years old and he was a big football star, right? What happened? The dynamics of power changed. Could those kids push him around now? No, they couldn't. The dynamics of power changed, and they had to accept the change in the dynamics of power, right? So, what are we talking about? Even when someone says, well, back in 1809, the Russians were doing this. Well, you can say, but what the Russians were doing back in 1995 or 2003, this ain't the same Russia. The power dynamics changed. And so, what we're looking at a lot of times is, and I see this everywhere with the US and say Iran or whoever, wherever they are. As Martin was just talking about Israel, right? Ben Gurion versus the present crew, right? Accepting the limits of your power. Someone that
yes,
says we're a small country and we can go to war, but we can only do this. And then we have to have all reserves because we only have a certain amount of people. Our army can only be so
exactly.
big. Therefore, there are limits to our power that we have to accept, as opposed to people now who are like, well, we just got to attack everybody and we'll take the whole region. With a country of 7, 8, 9 million people, you're going to take
Exactly.
a region of like 500 million. I don't see how that works. But you're not accepting the limits of your power, right? Finland, that's what we're talking about now. What are the military limits of their power? Right? What can they do? The how have the power dynamics changed? The Russias. You look at the Russias of the 1990s, a very poor, country that was struggling to, deal with the changes that it had, as opposed to now a country that's on the rise. Economically, they're, on the way back up, and they're a pretty powerful country, and they have a lot of very powerful weapons. So you have to say, regardless of the power dynamics 5 years ago, 10 months ago, 5 months ago, what are the power dynamics now, and how can we be fluid? How can we adjust with the power dynamics? How can we accept the limits of our power? Right. And that's what's, I think, happening in the West. I'm looking at what's happening right now. Um, with the Ukraine conflict, etc. And I see maybe a France, a Germany, the UK, who should be looking at right now saying, "Man, we're about to run out of energy. How do we
Yes,
deal with that?" Instead of saying we have to stand up to Russia or China or anybody else. You have internal problems. You got to deal with your internal problems. But they can't accept that the limits of their power, they can't accept any limits to their power.
I
And
know it's
that's,
very
I think that's
strange.
your
Yeah.
problem.
I don't know what it is, if they really believe what they're putting out, or whether there's a mismatch. I mean, we don't have national leaders anymore. We have leaders who can always take off with a pension fund. If it's a personal thing, they will always be looked after because we live in an international world, whereas before we didn't so much. And if you really let your side down, you would be locked into or and maybe hanged on the main square of the capital. Whereas now you just jump on a jet plane and you have a Bitcoin billionaire supporting you somewhere or something, whatever it is. Or you can always go to America and sit on Millionaires Row or something. There's a kind of personal mismatch there. I think as youth, I mean, older people are wiser because the older you get, the more you realize the limits of a personal power and how age bears down on you, and it makes you wiser in
yes,
what nations can achieve, right? And young people don't know their limits. And we've got a young political class in Europe, particularly because they've all, when we were rich in Europe, smart young people went and did other things. They became bankers or whatever, which is easy money. And only the idiots stayed in politics, and they're the ones who are now in politics, and they rose very quickly. So, whereas before you'd spend 30 years on the diplomatic circuit before you became foreign minister, now the last couple of foreign ministers in the UK have literally no experience at all. They've just come in and they've just been in parliament 2 or 3 years, so they don't know anything about geopolitics. And we're comfortable. I mean, we've been comfortable for 80 years in Europe, so we haven't known hardship or effort or struggle. So it gives a sense of hubris, I guess. And if you've conquered your own domestic political system and you're the foreign minister or something, oh, that was easy. Well, I'll take on Putin because that's also going to be easy. No, it ain't, folks, you know. So, but we've got a political class. I mean, we're facing huge energy crisis this summer if nothing happens, and people are not talking about. Instead, they're just blurting, they're just talking this incredible sort of self-serving reality, unreality discussion. I mean, about defeating Russia, rather than dealing with and they get slaughtered in the polls, but they don't care because they don't know they won't be in, under election, and then they probably steal the election, and or they'll combine with the opposition to create a grand coalition against the people. But I mean, in Britain, they've been slaughtered just yesterday. I mean, people don't want war. They don't want energy costs. They don't. There's too much immigration. There's too much. Young people can't get on the housing ladder, can't get jobs. They're overeducated. There's a seething
Absolutely.
anger all over Europe, you know, and I guess the United States as well. And yet our
Oh, very
leaders are
much in the
talking about
United
defeating
States.
Russia as if that's going to be, you know. Anyway, what are your thoughts, Martin?
I fully agree with you, Pelle. I think you've nailed it. Garland, I'd be interested. Do you, Pelle speaks to me. I feel it instinctively. But from your Garland, from your perspective, does that apply here in the US as well? I think it does, but am I wrong?
No, no, it's kind of a Western phenomenon as Western economic and military power, decreases. There's a refusal to accept that. Look,
Yes.
there's China. No, 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 China's not right. Yeah, that's reality. They're making a lot of money, and with money, a lot of money comes a lot of power. No, 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 that can't be. So that's all over the West, I think.
Hmm.
And and,
I think
and you have interesting. There's no honor amongst thieves. We have a political class now that pretends to be united, but the United States will eat Europe in a second. They'll steal whatever they can amongst their so-called allies and friends. The allies and friends now, they're pretending to be united against Russia or China or Iran, whoever the hell. But meanwhile, they're fighting like cats and dogs amongst
yes.
themselves.
Yeah.
I fully agree with you. I mean, if one looks at the deal Britain made with Ukraine, with secret clauses in the 100-year treaty, which, of course, the Ukrainians, to the amazement of the British, immediately leaked to the public at once. Exactly. But what were the terms of that treaty? It was neocolonialism in the most terrible
Hmm.
kind.
Hmm.
It was that the terms Britain had imposed on China in 1842 and 1860 under Lord Palmerston that guaranteed that hundreds of millions of people in the most populous and previously most advanced and prosperous nation on earth, China, would be reduced to a level of despair, drug addiction, slavery, mass rape, and just general destitution and rural misery that lasted for 100 more years that they only really came out of in the 1970s. Even it took them 30 years to climb out even from their own revolution to start getting on the path to stability in the 1970s. And even then, they were really only able to do it because the US Russia Soviet confrontation blocked both the great powers from going in, and the British weren't there to hold them back anymore, which is totally denied and forgotten in Britain. But if I may add one point, there's an amazingly obscure period in European history, which a friend of mine, who I wish we could have on, but I think you're familiar with him, Bill Lind, the military analyst, used to work for Gary Hart. And 25 years ago, Bill, who was already opposing our mad rush to war, and what you and I well remember, the global war on terror, Bush's solution to all the problems that we faced in America. How did that turn out? And Bill was on the side of the angels, i.e., you and me and our friends and colleagues then. And I said, has this happened before? He said, there is a book you should read, Marty, a biography of the Prime Minister of Spain 400 years ago, the Count Duke of Olivares. What on earth is the Count Duke of Olivares? Only a genius like Bill Lynn would be familiar with this. But he explained what it was. It was after the Spanish Armada. The Spanish Empire was in a tailspin. None of the ruling class wanted to work. They'd been spoiled by 150 years of easy wealth from the gold and silver of the Americas. And France was taking over from them. So were England and Holland. They were down. The country was going destitute. It was bankrupt. So what was the solution? to carve out an empire at the other end of Europe in the Baltic Sea. Of course, to get there, you'd have to get past the English and the French and the Dutch first. And they weren't even able to get to first step number one. I thought it came back to me recently. I mean, it was very funny and entertaining at the time. But even then, I could see the sense of what Bill was saying. But what you're saying brought it to mind again. Is that not what we're doing here, confronting China when we can't even take, when it would be suicidal for us to even attempt to attack Iran on its own home grounds, fighting everybody at the same time? Turning America into an Israel on a colossal scale, and the Israelis have gone mad too, and the Brits have gone mad.
Mm.
I mean,
Yeah.
what's happening in these cultures?
If I might add something quickly,
Sure, guys. Sorry.
real quickly, just a comment to that. And it's interesting you mentioned neocolonialism because recently there was a big battle in Mali where French-backed, whatever you want to call them, proxy forces tried to retake Mali. I think one of the things you're seeing is as neoliberalism hollows out the economies of the U.S. and Canada and Europe, the only plan they have is we have to go back to colonialism. We have to go back, and when we
Yes.
know this thing ain't working, we're going broke. We'll go back to Africa and take that stuff. Russia, oh, that's an opportunity. They got lots of stuff. We can take that there to look around the world and say, let's go over Iran. I think that it was about, well, we can get the Straits of Hormuz, we can get their oil, their gas. So I think there's a desperate attempt to revert to raw colonialism and say we're going broke and we're being hollowed out. Let's just go take some stuff from somebody. But the dynamics have changed and they don't have the kinetic and military ability to do that like they did before. Those people had spears and bow and arrows. You had muskets. Those days are gone.
Mm.
Yes.
Do you think, I mean, that's what Rubio was saying in his Munich speech. You thought he was taking the piss because it was so blatant. He said, well, we once conquered the world, let's do it again.
Yeah. He just
I
didn't mention
mean,
the neoliberal
even
part,
if they
but
could,
because we're
even if they
going
were able
broke.
to do it, it would be massively politically incorrect. I mean, you don't say it, but I don't think even they can do it, even if they wanted to. So it was a
Exactly.
double loss. Yeah. Um, oh well. Yeah, and then thinking about and Lithuania, for instance, a pygmy country of 3 million. I mean, all the delusions of the big countries of Western Europe are you see in spades in the Baltic states. They're countries of 1 million people or 2 million people. They've just liberated themselves from Russian electricity, which means that their electricity supply has quadrupled the electricity prices. Now they've
Exactly.
blocked an, a free trade agreement with China. You know, to satisfy the Americans or something. So this little pygmy country, Lithuania, can do that, and they've colonized the European institutions because that's the way. If you're up and coming, I mean, like the Irish were in Tammany Hall in the 19th century, you rise up through the political system. So that's what the Balts have done. It's become Estonianized with that idiot foreign minister, who so our foreign policy has become that of a small, aggressive East European ex-Nazi country, and it's not in. And the sad thing about Western Europe is we have interest going in all different directions. Because one of the reasons why Finland was successful was they all have the same mind. They didn't want to be part of the Soviet Union. They couldn't say it openly, but every single Finn knew it. We don't want to be communist, and we don't mind the Russians, but we don't want to be. And so it was actually a great unifier of that country, in a way that Finland hadn't been unified during the aristocratic era when the Finns, the white Swedish speakers versus the red Finns. Everyone, yeah, Max Jakobsen said, knew exactly the game they had to play, and they all kept quiet and they all trod very carefully. They're all on the same mission, but you don't get that in Europe today. We're also going in different directions. No one's really agreed, and we're too big to play that. We're too big to be Finlandized in Western Europe the European Union. And we're too small to be a big military power. So we're in a real dilemma. Anyway, we just got a few minutes left. Do either of you want to say anything about this winding up?
Martin, go ahead,
Garland?
Martin. Um, no, no,
We're both being too polite to each other, but you're the guest. Please, Garland, go ahead.
well, I just think that one of the things that's going on right now, the Iran conflict is going to have a pronounced effect on this for this reason, because neoliberal leadership, these lunatics that have somehow come to power and that are, have a tenuous grip on power, in my opinion, the Merz, Macron, Starmer ilk. I think that the uh, precipitous drop in energy availability and the rise in prices are going to finish off their, it's going to really, eliminate their ability to hold on to power. I think that people are going to go furious. Things could get really bad in Europe and even in the US. So I think that their ability to hold on to power here in the next several months will be significantly affected by the, just almost immediate decrease in the most citizens' ability to even survive economically. So I think that a big part of this will be dealt with over the course of this summer. Add one thing: Europe builds up its gas supplies, in the summer and fall for the winter. They're going to have nothing next winter. There's no gas supplies
Yes.
are going to be built. They will have zero going into next winter, even if this thing is, because everybody needs gas supplies and a lot of gas infrastructure has been destroyed. So next winter is going to be a bad winter. If they don't lose power this summer, they'll lose power in the fall and winter. So
Right.
if
Okay.
Martin.
We'll wind up with that. I mean, one of the things we had John Helmer on earlier, and I thought that he was focusing on Russia failing, but I mean, you got to look at the whole picture, which is that we're all failing, and the question is who fails first. I mean, Russia's doing badly, but my God, Ukraine's doing much worse, and Europe's doing pretty badly as well. So it's good to have all these guests on because it's all these perspectives all add up to the whole truth, I think. So thank you so much, Garland and Martin. We'll see you
Here,
tomorrow.
here.
Thank you. Take care. Have a good afternoon.
Garland, come back soon.
Thank you very much, gentlemen.